So my name is Ellen Litchfield. I'd just like to recognise that Farmers for Climate Action acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we work, and the traditional owners of the land our guests and speakers are all joining us from. We pay our respects to our elders past and present. I am joining you from Arabana country over in South Australia. And if you'd like to share the country you're joining from in the chat, please feel free. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. We've got a really, really exciting webinar for you today with a great panel. So firstly, I just want to give you a little bit of info about what Farmers for Climate Action is. We were started in 2016 by a group of farmers in the Blue Mountains, and our mission is to influence Australia to adopt strong economy-wide climate policies and realise a prosperous and sustainable future full of opportunity for farmers and farming communities alike. So one of the areas and ways in which that we try and reach this mission is through our reports and research that we do on identifying climate change impacts and pathways to emissions reductions for farmers. And a few years ago, we did a report on called Fork in the Road, which I'd urge you to have a look at on our website if you haven't already. And it was a bit of a different avenue for Farmers for Climate Action, and it focused more on the economical and business case side of climate change and the impacts that we are already feeling. It's not a faraway problem. It's not a future problem. It's a here and now problem. And so as a result of that, we wanted to explore this further and look at or sort of quantify and understand the impacts of climate change on the cost of living crisis that we are seeing in Australia today and across the world, really. And so to do that, we engaged one of our valued partners at Corporate Value Associates and looked at the cost of climate change at the checkout. And I'll hand over to Rob Poole now to introduce himself and a bit about the report and how it came to be. Thank you.
Hi, Alan, and thanks for having me along, and hi to all on the webinar. It's great to work with Natalie Collard and Alan and Caleb and the team at FCA. When I was asked about writing the paper relating to the cost of the checkout and the impact of inflation, I thought that was an important context and well-timed question, Alan, because I've been doing some other research in the cost of living in relation to vegetables and consumption in that sector. And I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of consumers, everyday Australians in the last sort of few months. And certainly that cost of living crisis that we've lived through in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years is a very profound issue. I was born in the 70s, lived through the high interest rates and inflation of the late 80s and early 90s, but we've had a very long period, Alan, of relatively low inflation, and it's been a very strong year, prosperous time for Australia. So when that came along with COVID and that high inflationary period, it's really a different Australia, is how I would describe it. It's a very different context now. So it's an important question to look at climate change, climate risk, climate shocks in the inflationary context, if that makes sense, because it's really important to Australians and the cost of living in every day in their lives. The other context that I tried to put into the paper, Alan, was risk. The reason I chose risk as such a key facet is because it has real meaning to commercial businesses, to boards and CEOs. And, I think for us to write this through a lens of risk helps us get our message across to corporate Australia as well. because the boards are very focused on risk. Indeed, they have obligations to report climate risk and supply chain impacts from climate risk. And I had an opportunity to advise the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we were looking at the multiple risks occurring at once, and the fact that traditional risk management looked at a single risk. But what we're seeing now, Alan, emerge in the agricultural supply chain or the food industry is multiple things occurring at once. It's quite a complex supply chain in parts of the food sector. And we discussed that a lot in the paper, that there's a lot of international impacts, there's a lot of domestic impacts, and we really tried to unpack the nuances of the different sectors. So then we started to move into the issue itself, and we decided, Alan, to look at it through the lens primarily of the different products. How does climate risk, climate shocks, climate change impact the different products? The reason why we did that is because the major agricultural commodities are all quite different in terms of their market structures. So grain and meat, for example, are very globally traded and tend to be therefore priced based on global markets and the value of the Aussie dollar. So the minute you introduce that kind of global traded aspect, the climate impacts to inflation start to become global as well. So what we saw in the paper is that we had a lot of discussion around the impact of the US supply chain, the impact in the case of coffee, which we'll talk about in Brazil, in terms of rice, the impact in Asia. So, clearly this is not an Australian climate discussion. This is a global climate risk discussion. And the nature of the products that we both export and import, we had to have that discussion in the paper so that we could start to see, well, what causes inflation? And it's not just climate shocks in Australia, it's climate shocks all around the world. And we discussed quite a lot of examples of those, and particularly in areas, as I said, like the big export product areas. Dairy we discussed as well, and it's an interesting one because even though we're primarily domestic dairy industry now, maybe 70-80%, but we do have a lot of connection with New Zealand. So that's a nuance of the dairy industry because there's a lot of imports coming in from New Zealand now, and dairy prices are very high at the moment. If you look at the discussion in New Zealand, it's a very big discussion around the domestic inflationary impacts in things like butter. I follow the media in New Zealand quite closely, and the butter price is a huge discussion in New Zealand at the moment. Then we talked a lot in the paper about horticulture, poultry, eggs, industries that are primarily domestic, and the fact that climate shocks on those industries in Australia are much more important or profound when it comes to inflationary impacts. So we talk a lot about the potential risk of more climate events in Australia, floods, fires, droughts, even the change in patterns of potential diseases like avian flu we've seen lately. And are things like that going to change their nature because of, say, warmer temperatures in later in the year into the autumn, for example? And then I mentioned coffee and rice, where we import almost all our coffee is imported. About a third of our rice nowadays is imported. So hopefully, Alan, we did a really good job of describing the climate risk and the inflation risk for each of those products and giving them a kind of a context in terms of how each of those products is impacted by climate change and inflation. Climate change also has impacts that are uneven. In some cases, farmers even can benefit from it because a shock in one part of the system can cause a farm gate price rise. And we gave that example, say, in bananas, where a cyclone might hit a particular region and the impact on that region is profound. So their crops wiped out, but all the other banana producers actually get increase in prices. But the take-home message from that is that the end result is inflationary. The end result is that the consumer ends up paying more. So there's this very uneven application of climate shocks in farming, but usually the impact is inflation because generally those shocks will push up costs. They'll unevenly impact farmers, but they'll almost always push the price up at the checkout. Um, so we discussed that a bit in terms of the unevenness of this impact, but the end is inflation. The final comment I'd make, Alan, before I hand back to you is that when we design the responses to climate change, so as we start to move into how does agriculture and the food system actually change, we need to be cognizant that we want to do that very efficiently and not add cost to the farm sector, and preferably not too much cost to the consumer either. As I said in my intro, the consumer is very sensitive to the cost of goods and food at the moment. They're not in a good position to pay more for food. So we need, as we design our solutions, we need to have them positively correlated with farm productivity, which most of the solutions on farm, I think, will be positively correlated with productivity. And we also need to design really efficient data reporting systems that don't add too much cost to the overall supply chain. Happy to come back and visit that question. So thanks again for letting me write the essay. I hope it was really interesting. I love obviously talking about this sort of stuff. You know, ultimately there is a big risk that this will continue to have an impact on food prices. So it's something we need to keep talking about. So thanks again. And I know you wanted to talk about some of the conclusions, so I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yeah, and so from that information that was collected, the recommendations that Farmers for Climate Action has developed from there are the first one, not surprisingly, is deep emissions reductions this decade to protect farmers and our food supply from more and worse climate shocks. Greater investment in farm adaptation, resilience, and risk management. And developing a national food strategy that starts on farm, supporting nature-friendly farming, growing biodiversity, and emissions reductions. And a discussion paper was released on the national food strategy just yesterday. So that's really exciting development and something that we will be really working on and hoping to influence to make sure that it works for the environment, our farmers, and our food supply chain. Now we've got a really great lineup of speakers coming along, and they're just going to do quite short intros. So then we've got a lot of time for questions to really explore the themes that that came out of this cost of climate change at the checkout report. We've got speakers from across the supply chain. So we're going to start now with Chris Poole, is a cherry farmer in Young and knows firsthand the impacts of climate change on his production. And obviously it's also a really good one to demonstrate because it's a shorter supply chain, shall I say. He does a lot of direct to consumer as well, and is very familiar with the domestic supply chains in Australia. And he was also the New South Wales Farmer of the Year in 2019, which is a really great claim to fame. Chris, I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Chris Hall from Hall Family Orchards, regenerative cherry orchard. Also been chemical free since 2018. So yeah, the main goal for our orchard is really just to make the trees as healthy as possible, so that it looks after itself. And now that the way that we're doing things now, more regeneratively, we are reducing our costs. We're also making a lot of our inputs on site, making our own fertilizers. We've got a worm farm. We make our own compost, mainly as inoculants, but not large-scale composting, but just inoculating the soil with microbes. And yeah, my background is in nutrition, so with the combination of nutrition and microbes, we're able to grow healthy fruit, which is good for our consumers, but also they taste a lot better, and we're able to lower our input costs. So when we do have some of these events, which we've had plenty of in the last few years, and it has been tough, we're not outlaying as much money. My conventional friends in the industry possibly spend $5,000 to $10,000 a hectare on inputs, on just chemical and fertilizer alone, whereas my inputs are around about $1,000 a hectare, give or take, and getting better all the time as we keep improving the system. But just to demonstrate, I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is the hail damage that we suffered around Christmas time this year. So my father used to say that we'd get hail once in 4 years. A couple of years ago, we got 4 lots of hail in the 1 year. 3 of them did this sort of damage. Like usually you're worried about damaging the fruit, and yes, it smashed the fruit, but when it's that severe and damaging limbs, and my trees are just peppered from a couple of years ago and then again last year. But yeah, and big rainfall events, it's been tough. So it's been very important for us to reduce our input costs so we can survive those events where we don't get an income. Also, yeah, we look at everything. So we've got strategies in place for frost damage. Last year was a big frost event. We had about 3 frosts in a row that were -5 or 6, and then the 4th and 5th day they were still -3 and 4. So they're devastating for the industry. But with nutrition and with the microbes, we can reduce that frost risk, and we've been able to see that. We use a certain microbe that is amazing in dropping that protection down to that -5, -6 level. So yes, there's lots of things we can do. We're always looking at the heat. We're using microbes and nutrition again to protect against heat, giving the plant the resilience to cope with those events. Same with cold, because cherry is such a short season. We only grow from blossom through to harvest can be anything from 6 to 12 weeks. So that after blossom, there's really the leaves can be, the fruit's really only there for 4, 5, up to 10 weeks. So it's a really short season. So we have to get everything right. So we can't afford any setbacks in that time. So if we do get heat or cold, it's a setback. So we try and minimize that. So we have ways that we can overcome in cold periods as well, using microbes and nutrition. And rain, yeah, rain's always pretty hard with cherries. Everyone knows they're pretty finicky, and yeah, we're doing our best to mitigate against that. There's sometimes some polymers and things that you can put onto the surface of the cherries. Again, using nutrition and trying to get calcium and a balanced nutritional approach. And now we're also using amino acids now, showing for some potential to regulate osmosis, which also helps in heat times. So yeah, so we're always looking at different avenues. But yeah, one of the big ones in the last couple of years that's really been hard for us is this hail damage. It's not much you can do about it. We're trying to grow bushier trees, but yeah, when it comes down in the size of big marbles, not the little ones, but the big tombolas, there's not much you can do about it. So yeah, we're still do our best to look at all the avenues of our business, and probably like to touch on the first aspect of going down this regenerative line. And the one thing that I'm grateful for, when I came home from school 30 years ago, I planted a lot of trees and shrubs, and I've got a really good diversity happening on my little farm. It's only a small place, but just having that diversity is definitely the first step towards this system. And especially in the cold years when we've had really cold, wet weather during blossom, we've had hoverflies and all this sorts of different insects other than bees. Bees would only get out for like 2 or 3 hours a day, but we had all these other insects helping to pollinate. And yeah, it's just amazing once you get into a natural system and Mother Nature starts to take over. It's just fantastic. So I think I should leave it at that. Back to you.
Thank you, Chris. That is so interesting. And it's a really good example of the measures and practice changes that you're taking on your farm are making you more resilient and not necessarily increasing the cost to our consumer at the other end. You're doing all that you can on farm to increase your productivity and decrease emissions sort of hand in hand as Rob discussed earlier. And I guess it just comes down to one of the, I really loved you bringing the visual example. That was great. And it is, there is a tipping point and at some point, there's only so much you can do. Like you said, you're trying to grow bushier trees but yeah, it's a really tricky balancing act. And I think, yeah, a fantastic example of practice and on-farm change that can make you more resilient to climate shocks. And I'm sure we've already had a lot of questions coming through that will be directed over to you, Chris. Thank you. All right, so our next panelist is Mike Brabant. He is the CEO of Single O Coffee, and it is a coffee bean supplier across Australia, and I think they've also got a coffee bean roasting house in Japan as well, which is really exciting. So we've got Mike here to talk sort of about that a bit further along. So we've gone past the farm gate now in the supply chain. And obviously coffee was highlighted in our report as well. It's been suffering a lot from some really intense climate shocks. It was even in the news just this morning about the impacts on our coffee prices. So thank you so much, Mike. I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Ellen. Just a little bit about us. So I'm a Kiwi, which you can hear, obviously, but working for a business called Single O and we started in 2003, and we're an independent specialty coffee company born out of Surrey Hills. So our business is the reason we started, we're originally called Single Origin Roasters, and the whole concept of the business was sourcing and bringing in transparent and well-sourced coffee into the Australian market and roasting it in a particular way and charging a premium for a quality product. That's the sort of meaning of specialty coffee. The number one problem with coffee is economic often. And so by paying a higher price for quality, for a quality product, we're actually moving more money into the right areas of the world. That was the fundamental start of specialty coffee in around the world. So we started in Surrey Hills in 2003. Today, we've got roasting operations in Sydney and Tokyo, and we support clients across Australia and Japan, as well as Asia. We're a B Corp organization with lots of little things from I think originally what we wanted to do was show coffee as an agricultural product. So we're buying from farmers across 26 countries. So to give you a flavor, as Robert pointed out, Brazil's the biggest producer of coffee in the world. So they're our number one buyer, but we also buy from 26 other countries, but Ethiopia, Kenya, Costa Rica, Vietnam would be our top 5. So we're importing, 36 to 40 containers of 19,000 kilo containers a year of coffee, and we're importing that into Australia and then roasting and selling that. So that's our core business. It's often forgotten about, right, that we take for granted that cup of coffee that our barista, and we appreciate our barista, but there's a farmer, or we call producer, working on the other end in Kenya that could be hand growing that, riding it to a washing station, processing that. It's packed, it's exported, imported, we roast it, it gets to a cafe. So there's actually a pretty long and labor intensive and many hand supply chain in our business. So that's our core business. In 2019, what we saw was a report by the World Coffee Research, which estimated by 2050, half of the land suitable for growing Arabica coffee would be unsuitable for growing it. And that was a 000 for us. So we've always had baked into our whole business to care about climate, when little things like we never sold a plastic bottle at our cafes back in 2003, but we also co-created the Juggler, which removed 100,000 milk bottles from the waste stream. Our roastery solar powered, we've always tried to bake that into everything we did, but in 2019, that was kind of an emergency for us. And we tripled down on what we were doing. So what we've seen, and I guess what Robert touched on, is you've seen a spike, and I can promise you it's not cafes gouging. I can promise you that, what's been the catalyst for the coffee price is climate. So we had successive droughts and floods in Brazil and Vietnam, which caused coffee price increases of around 100% on our costs. So to give you a figure, that added $2.5 million on our additional green bean buy for the year that we didn't predict. So that might sound like not a lot for some of your size of your business, but for us, that was a lot. That's what we were staring down the barrel of. And that started that. And then we, as Robert said, we're importing coffee, right? So we're buying in US dollars. So we had a low US dollar at 63 to 65 cents, and we'd enjoyed 74, coupled with a shortage, which then meant speculators and futures traders bought coffee without physically actually buying coffee on the commodities market, which just hyperinflated the price. So the catalyst of all that was climate. Ultimately, though, what you guys and everyone's left with is what we're saying is about $5.50 to $6 is what you should be paying for a well-made, well-sourced and ethical coffee in Australia today, and that's probably not even enough. Our single O Surrey Hills Cafe, we're charging $6.50. Of course, you can get a cheaper coffee, but that's been the impact. So what we've been really focused on is what we can do. So there's what's happening at the origin is climate resistant varieties. So we've been working with what are called F1 hybrids, and those are higher yielding and more protective to weather adaptation. So they're different varieties. There's also Catamore cultivars, which are resistant to leaf rust. So that's at the producer area. So actually people are working on climate resistant varieties to support yields, because we've just seen so much more volatility that we can't track it. I'm working on a grant with someone who's working with AI modeling to see if I can get a further look on coffee buying and purchasing and the modeling and what's happening with weather patterns. And then at home, I guess it's making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're not exacerbating the impact on agriculture from our own business. So last thing I'll leave you with is the second biggest emitter in our business, crazily enough, is coffee grounds. So coffee production and agriculture is number one, but coffee grounds. So when we make a coffee, the coffee goes into those black knot tubes that you see sitting in cafes. You hear the baristas knocking it, knocking it out. There's over 75 million kilos of spent grounds that go to landfill and are incorrectly disposed across Australia, and they emit methane gas into the atmosphere, which is 30 times more potent than like a single CO2. So we are working as part of our business model to work with a company called Reground to get coffee grounds out of landfill. So we actually include that in our service to our customers in Melbourne, and we're bringing them to New South Wales in the coming months. So, and that was 30% of our overall emissions as a business was incorrectly disposed. Yet worms do love coffee grounds. We did have an idea for a business called Worms on Wheels, which was collecting that. So we see it as last thing I'll say, and just I'll move on, is, ultimately our business relies on our farmers and our producers having a business. So we have this whole No Death to Coffee campaign and climate that we're running, which is around reducing emissions, becoming more circular, and making sure that we can enjoy coffee until 2050. And ultimately, that's our mission now as a business since 2019. And commercially, we've grown. So it's worked too. So that's a little bit about us. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. That is really interesting, and I am definitely pro survival of coffee. Yeah, we've got a coffee subscription and we love it in this house. And excited to, I think there would have been a lot of farmers listening into that, thinking about, coffee grounds, fertilizer, how can I use this? How can I use this byproduct? Yeah, really interesting, and obviously some really strong points there about the.
And that's one of we're trying to get that too, because it's high in nitrogen. So we did pose at a recent symposium, was like, if we could get that into a fertilizer for farmers because it's high in nitrogen, that would be great. Anyway, watch this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you'll definitely make a lot of connections here today. That we've got a lot of farmers hugely interested in circular economies and how we can, reduce and use waste. And also for those of you that I don't think Mike mentioned, but Singalo is a B Corp as well. So they've got some really huge sustainability goals and targets that they've already met and have set, it's really fantastic, and a good demonstration of a, supply chain doing it, trying to doing it as effectively as possible for everyone, from its farmers to its consumers, because we are all feeling the pinch. I don't live anywhere near a cafe, but if I did, I would definitely still be wanting to buy my morning coffee, even if it was $6.50. Okay, next speaker now is Lily Pachif, for the Associate Director of Natural Capital at NAB. And so Lily's going to have a chat with us and demonstrate her knowledge in the other end of the issue that we've come across with the cost of climate change at the checkout report, and the financial side, and how agrifinance can help our farmers, as well as trying to put a value on the natural capital loss. So, we've obviously got a clear value of the cost at the checkout and the food, and the farmers know the production costs, but it's that loss of other natural capital that doesn't necessarily have a immediately intrinsic value. But as we heard in Chris's talk, the microbes and the whole ecosystem, those other hoverflies, they all have a really important role to play, and are extremely important in the resilience of the business. So I'll pass over to you now, Lily.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute today. So just a little bit about myself and where I sit within the bank. So some of you might not think it's a very intuitive for a bank to have a role like mine, which is in our environmental affairs team, where we look at what's happening, I guess, externally to the bank, and developments related to climate and nature, and how we can bring that inside the bank to help inform how we support customers who are, dealing with the impacts of climate change and nature degradation in the course of their business. So I joined the bank about 3 years ago, but in fact, the role that I hold at the bank has been around since about 2011, when we signed an international declaration called the Natural Capital Declaration. And that's really all about trying to make sure that aspects of the environment that aren't typically kind of considered in financial terms on balance sheets start to appear and get considered on the same way that we think about other aspects of capital, like financial capital or human capital. So within the bank, my role involves understanding the kind of research that Farmers for Climate Action develop, and the surveys that they produce on the Climate Smart Toolkit, but also supporting other types of research that help us better understand how we can support customers as they attempt to adapt to climate change and indeed to mitigate their own impacts. Some of the work that Ellen mentioned is what's the bank's role in this space? Well, one of the things that we can do is support customers with different types of financial products. So earlier this year, we were really happy to launch a partnership with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. That partnership is about making capital available for customers who want to invest to help mitigate their emissions, and also, I guess, alongside that, look to enhance their natural capital. So with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, we now have a product in market that can be used to help support the purchase of fertilizer that has nutrification inhibitors included within them. We also support anything that looks like that helps methane inhibitors, or includes methane inhibitors. Reforestation projects are part of that program as well, along with pasture rejuvenation from legumes and installation of solar and battery projects. So all of those types of, accessing discounted finance to make those kind of purchases or changes on farm are about helping our customers to reduce their emissions, reduce and increase their resilience to the impacts of climate change, and along the way, also improve the profitability and productivity of their farms. I might, Ellen, I know you wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I might stop there and we can get into the questions now.
Thank you so much, Lily. Yeah, and it's really interesting getting a gauge, and obviously appreciate all of our listeners jumping in and having a bit of a chat with you in the chat box as well. Lily, I'll direct this first question at you. What do you think the finance sector should be doing to help farmers with the transition to make the food system more resilient to the increasing climate shocks we will inevitably face?
Thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess speaking from the perspective of where I sit within NAB, we're a large agribusiness bank. A lot of our focus has been on farm, as distinct from further down the supply chain, I guess. And I think our role is really about the sort of financial products that we can offer to customers. So as I mentioned there, the types of discounted finance that we've been able to provide with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is a big part of the solution. The other thing that we do is we invest in research. So one of the programs of research that we've invested in recently has been with an organisation called Farmers for the Future. That research has really been focused on trying to understand the role that natural capital plays on farms and the contribution that it can make to productivity, profitability, and ultimately resilience. And that research was funded in part by Meat and Livestock Australia and by National Farmers Federation. And it looked at what balance of natural capital is on farms, so measuring things like species diversity, but also water, vegetation, soil, and whatnot, and then looking at farm financial performance and understanding the relationship between the two. And they have found a positive relationship between the level and quality of natural capital on farms and farm ability to profitability and productivity. So we have a role in sort of supporting that type of research, which then can help farmers make informed decisions about do we put the entire farm to crops this year, or do we leave some for that might be not so profitable for cropping, but also provides habitat for a range of species that could could be habitat for pollinators that enhance, you know, the rest of the cropping area. The financial sector, you know, also, I guess, has a role to play in terms of how we support, or the types of emissions and targets that we set. So NAB's been very busy looking at our highest emitting sectors and responding to that so that we can meet our targets around net zero by 2050 as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lily. I appreciate the chat is very active. We received a lot of questions before this webinar when everyone was registering, and obviously a lot of them did ask about the duopoly and the role of supermarkets in our food system, and how can we better encourage the major players in our supply chain to incentivize and promote food systems which are better for our climate. Mike, I'd like to throw this one to you. You are, you know, you're not in that supply chain. You're working for a company, you've created your own supply chain, essentially. What do you think we can do to, or what can the consumer, is it the consumer's role to get to shop better, or, you know, find alternatives to this duopoly supply chain, and how can we incentivize and promote food systems which are better for our climate?
Good question. I mean, I can talk you through our experience with supermarkets. Obviously a great channel, employ a lot of people. They'll come to us post-COVID wanting to sell a lot of coffee in that channel. For us, it comes back to representing the quality and the produce of the producer and farmer, and honouring what we've paid good money and imported for. So we tried to put it as sort of a fresh product within the supermarket, because coffee is actually best between 9 to 21 days, if anyone didn't know that. That's kind of the sweet spot. So we were trying to put it in the fresh section, actually, to sort of communicate that coffee was a more fresh product. They were sort of keener just to have it in the classic aisles and stuff. So in the end, we said no, and sort of decided not to utilize that channel, which is fine, because we didn't think it would honor the product. The solution was we work with lots of independent cafes across Australia, and that's our core business. And we actually created something called super cafes. So the idea that if buy local and buy independent and buy from your local cafe, and if you can buy your bag of coffee from your local barista, that can actually help that local cafe a lot more. If they sold 10 to 20 bags a week, that can sometimes be the difference between that cafe having a good week or a bad week, to be honest, because they might make an extra $500, and that's really important. So I think the lesson we learned was, like, there's always a solution. Yes, it'd be great to get that business in the supermarket, but because it didn't support our product, I think we had to look outside at other channels and other ways to build our business as well as build our customers' businesses. So not saying that's the solution for necessarily everyone on this call, but that's certainly something we decided to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. That's really interesting, and thank you for answering. We've obviously got a lot of coffee lovers in the on the webinar as well. Yep. Chris, I'll just on that question as well. Do you mind just explaining a little bit about how you get your cherries to the consumer and the different channels that you use? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, we focus a lot on our farm gate shop just to help mitigate the ups and downs of the market. And it's direct to the consumer, and we get a lot of feedback from that, because our cherries obviously taste different, taste better. So it's really good to get that feedback and see which varieties people like, because all the varieties are different and everyone has a different palate. But we do produce more than we can sell in the farm gate shop. So We have a lady in Sydney who's an organic outlet that supplies to private people and to restaurants. So we utilise that best we can, and then the overflow goes into the Sydney markets, which can be quite challenging. It's all supply and demand. So usually, there's either a short supply and things run well for farmers, but when there's an oversupply, it can really backfire. And we saw that recently in the last 2 years, but probably worse than 2 years ago when we saw a lot of the shopkeepers that were buying our fruit off the Sydney markets. They just withdrew from the buying of cherries for 3 days, and there was a build up in the markets, and cases of cherry cases are usually 5 kilos, and they're sold different sizes, but generally the 3 main sizes, they were going for $40, $50 and $60 a box. And when the market just flooded with cherries, they dropped to $10, $20 and $30 a box, and it usually costs us $30 a box just to produce it. So if we can avoid those sort of occasions, it would be great. But the shopkeepers loved it because they kept the prices the same and could make a lot of money from it, but it doesn't help farmers that instance. So the farm gate shop is great for trying to level out the playing field, and people are willing to travel for our cherries, so we're fortunate there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. Rob, this next one is for you. The price of home brand milk at Coles and Woolworths has crept up 10 cents per litre in the past fortnight. So a 2 litre bottle of milk now costs $3.20 at either supermarket. And almost half of Australia's dairy farmers are either in drought or rebuilding from floods. And Australian dairy farmers released a statement today on this, and they're encouraging the retailers to ensure that this increase goes back to the farmer. What do you think we can do to support these farmers so we don't lose them forever?
Yeah, I think I noted in the paper that Coles and Woolies, I've worked with them a lot over the years. They're experts at pricing to markets, and they spend a lot of time connecting their pricing to, in Chris's case, wholesale markets. They're good at taking the benefits of that. They also need to pass on the benefits of it as well. It's going to come down to the strength of the contracts of the milk processors. They really have to have contracts that make sure they get a fair share of a price rise. Generally speaking, they will, especially if the opportunity is there to export. And that's why we put so much effort in our paper, Alan, to describe the different markets, because in theory, a meat producer could sell their product to multiple channels. That's getting harder in dairy because we don't export as much as we used to. It's a hard question to answer. It's a very commercial question, but in essence, it's going to come down to the capacity of, Bega, Saputo, Fonterra, the milk companies, to make sure that the contracts they have with Coles and Woolies, if there is a price rise, that it impacts the farm gate price. It should, in theory, it definitely should. There'll be some margin go to Coles and Woolies, and the rest of that margin is going to go back down the supply chain. But the price of dairy in New Zealand is a really critical thing, and the price of dairy in New Zealand is really high at the moment. So that's good for Australian farmers that's the case. If the price of New Zealand milk or products is low, then that can have the effect of bringing our price down here as well, because we import a lot of products from New Zealand. Just commenting on the last question as well, Alan, I'm putting a thought into that with you guys at FCA as well. The new policies are needed. There's a lack of policy in agriculture for answering that question. One of the things, for example, that's not contemplated well yet in agriculture is the tax system. There are big incentives in the tax system in other areas of society, like R&D and in potentially in renewables in the electricity sector. But I think that needs to be looked at definitely, is how does the tax system support farmers in doing, taking action. And the other benefit of using the tax system is that it's not as regressive as using consumer pricing. If inflation hits consumer pricing, it affects low-income households more. And that's the problem with inflation, is that it's regressive. It hurts low-income families. So we really need to look at this question of inflation in food, because if we let the consumer do all the heavy lifting, it will impact some people in society more than others. And that's where using the tax system and the government is an interesting policy area that, FCA and consultants like me should work on.
Thanks, Rob. That's really interesting. And I just want to touch on a comment that you made just at the end of that, really, is about the impacts of food price and, who has to bear the brunt of that and who is most vulnerable. And I think that is a really important point, and something that, FCA, obviously, we're speaking from our farmer members, but there's a lot of Australians that are food insecure at the moment, and the rising prices, can, feed into that. And this was posed by someone on the webinar. How does the way that we talk about food as a commodity impact policy that reflects food as a human right for everyone? And I think that's a really interesting question. If Rob, did you want to have an answer, and then maybe Mike?
I'll give a short answer. I've talked about this issue a lot because, I don't want climate change to be inflationary, and I don't want the response to be inflationary, because I think they've got that slightly wrong potentially in energy, for example. So we really need to work hard with government not to have both our response and the problem of climate shocks create food inflation, because to your point, it's just going to be devastating in Australia, let alone devastating in Africa, for example, or other parts of the developing world. So, it is about adaptation, it is about new crop varieties, etc. But it's also about how do you smartly use the tax system, for example, to mitigate some of this, as opposed to having all of the problem either pushed on us as the farm sector or pushed on consumers. Neither one of those is good. So, look, there might be a bit of social restructuring here that's needed to be done, and the tax system is a good way to potentially do that. I think there is a tax model similar to the R&D tax incentive, for example, that could be used here to help meet the cost of all this.
Thank you, Rob. That's really interesting.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. Yeah, so going back, I think that, it's an interesting question sort of for a few of you, but that you've taken coffee away from being a commodity, and you are, you're liking it as a fresh product. And, I guess do you think that I guess, how do you view food, and do you think that we do place too much emphasis on as a bulk commodity product?
Ooh, that's tough. Yeah, I mean, coffee is a commodity. That's what it is. Our product and what we source isn't. It's a specialty product, so we pay on average 250 times what a commodity coffee costs. So when people talk about fair trade in coffee, that's a really interesting one to talk about. So we'll pay 150% above fair trade for a higher quality product. It's because the number one issue, again, is economic empowerment. In lots of these countries are often much harder conditions than even us. A lot harder conditions than us, third world. And so redirecting more money there and paying them a higher price for a higher quality product is the number one impact we can have. So it's a hard one when people are struggling out there, and you're putting coffee prices up. And we know we need to do that to pay the farmer to ensure that they continue producing it and producing a good product and protecting producer and farmer livelihoods in Ethiopia and Brazil. But on the other hand, there's families here who are struggling, and so that's kind of a tough discussion. But I think the way we deal with that is like we have a product we source, and ultimately coffee's discretionary from a specialty point of view. We just have to manage it. It's tough. But we want to make sure that we look after our farmers and producers first and foremost, because without them, we don't have a business.
Yeah, that's really, really nice point. We've just got time for one last short question for you, Lily, if that's okay, because we have had a few of the similar vein that I want to make sure we can just get a quick answer, which is, I know, difficult. How can we accelerate mainstream natural capital accounting to recognize improved and better farming practices?
Yeah, well, not a quick answer, I'm afraid, but I think that this is an emerging field, I think, to recognize to begin with. It's not in some ways it's not even as advanced as our thinking around climate and carbon accounting. It takes in a broader number of factors, and there isn't a kind of a single unit like a CO2 equivalent that we can use for nature. So first thing to note is this is an emerging space. Second, so we need more research in some ways to make sure that not only research but then also communicating it. So to make sure that the findings from that work is accessible, and that there's also a very clear link there in that research between what the theory says and what the on the ground reality is. So I guess from my perspective, there's a bit of work still to go in terms of communicating concepts like natural capital. How do we think about them in balance sheets? But then thinking about, okay, so how does an organization like mine, that's all about the provision of capital, take that information into consideration? So, we know, I guess intuitively, that more sustainable businesses are better businesses for us. They're safer, they're lower risk for us. So what do we need to do to support customers who want to get to that space where they're more resilient to climate change? That would be my brief response, given we're already over time.
Thank you, Lily. And thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that we have a really exciting first time for Farmers for Climate Action, actually, and having a national summit in Canberra this September. So the 1st to the 2nd. Would love if some of you could join us there. We've got some really exciting speakers. We're going a cherry farmer from New Zealand, actually, talking about electrification. We probably should be making sure Chris is there too, and covering a lot of the topics that we talked about here, in that how can we make farming in Australia more productive, resilient, and more efficient, and so that the farmers are making money without having to pass on exorbitant costs to our consumers that are already struggling and really feeling the pinch of this. So yeah, would love to have you come along. If you can't make it to Canberra in September, then please share the report among your friends. You can find it on our website. If you're not already a member of Farmers for Climate Action, it's free to join for farmers and community members. So please join up, stay across what the work we're doing. We regularly put out reports. We've got another report coming out in September, which we're really excited about, that was supported by NAB. So thank you very much. And yeah, we are would love to have you join us, and thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really great discussion. A huge round of applause for our panelists. They all had a really great insight, and yeah, Really enjoyed listening to your stories and really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. Okay, thank you so much.